could see temperatures 15, maybe 16 degrees Celsius. That'll feel pretty warm, whereas it'll just be 2 or 3 in northern Scotland, with the snow likely to intensify here during Tuesday night. So we do have that Met Office yellow warning in place across northern Scotland. Zone of rain then working across England and Wales during Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, meaning Wednesday's a very different day with showers up and down the land. Rain showers for the majority, but some snow still across the far north. Those showers zipping through on a fairly brisk wind, so there will be some sunny spells, but that wind is going to bring a chill as well. Colder air moving in right across the UK. We may still get up to double figures across the south, but add on that wind and it will feel a lot colder, and temperatures dropping sharply across the far north with that snow slowly easing.
Coming up on Dan Wootton Tonight, are the left underplaying female anger at the growing trans athlete row? British long-distance runner Mara Yamauchi joins me to speak up for her sporting sisters. Plus, why self-inflicted distrust in the media is having real consequences for the people of Ukraine. Writer and lawyer Helen Dale is here on that. And as ever, I'll break down the day's headlines with my superstar panel. The Daily Express columnist Carol Malone, senior reporter at the newspaper Benjamin Butterworth, and the social commentator Esther Kraku. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Hey, welcome along on tonight's Mark Steyn Show, live on your telly and on your wireless. Populism, how's it going? And over on the other side of politics, underneath all the virtue signalling, are we in fact becoming a cold-hearted and merciless society? Also, remember the days, this is before Afghanistan, when we used to win wars? The Telegraph's Con Coughlin does, and he's here, and we'll close out the show with the great Sue Cook, because you can never have enough Sue Cook on TV and radio. Plus, your thoughts live and in real time, so do send them along. Email gbviews@gbnews.uk, tweet me at gbnews. All that coming up after the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Mark, thank you. The top story. The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has said Russia cannot remain a member of the UN Human Rights Council, given what she says is strong evidence of war crimes in Ukraine. The group Human Rights Watch say they've collected evidence of Russian forces committing war crimes in multiple Ukrainian cities, including gender-based violence and executions of civilians. Images from the town of Bucha on the outskirts of Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, shows a mass grave in the grounds of a church. The Kremlin denies any accusations related to the murder of civilians. But Liz Truss has described the attacks on civilians as heinous butchery and urged the international community to strengthen sanctions on Russia.
We need to announce a tough new wave of sanctions. The reality is that money is still flowing from the West into Putin's war machine, and that has to stop.
Liz Truss speaking earlier today. Well, in the United States, there's growing concerns now supporting a multinational team of international prosecutors to collect and analyse evidence of war crimes at the request of the country of Ukraine. And the US President Joe Biden has called for a war crimes trial over the killings in Bucha.
You saw what happened in Bucha. This warrants him, he is a war criminal. But we have to gather the information. We have to continue to provide Ukraine with the weapons they need to continue the fight. And we have to gather all the detail so this can be have a war crime trial.
Joe Biden speaking earlier today. Well, in other news, environmental scientists are warning that without immediate action to cut greenhouse gases, we'll face the catastrophic impacts of climate change. A UN report says it's necessary to keep temperatures from rising above 1.5 degrees by substantially reducing the use of fossil fuels. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, says the world must triple the speed of its switch to renewables.
The jury has reached a verdict, and it is damning. This report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a litany of broken climate promises. It is a file of shame, cataloguing the empty pledges that put us firmly on track towards an unlivable world.
Antonio Guterres speaking there. Some news just coming into us. The government says it's going to proceed with plans to privatise Channel 4. A spokesperson for the channel said it was disappointed with the decision. In an internal email seen by PA News, Channel 4 chief executive said the priority was to look after all staff and protect the wonderful Channel 4 spirit. More on that for you in the next hour of news. And in entertainment news, the EastEnders actress June Brown, best known for playing her character Dot Cotton, has died at the age of 95. Her family says she passed away peacefully at her home in Surrey last evening. EastEnders executive producer Chris Crenshaw said her portrayal of Dot Cotton made a huge impact on British television, which entertained the nation and at times changed it a little for the better. Dot Cotton, played by June Brown. On TV, online and on your radio via DAB+, you're with GB News. Now back to Mark Steyn.
Thank you, Polly. Some of us, maybe even a majority of us, are happy to wear masks in perpetuity and get jabbed every year, every month, every 20 minutes, whatever it takes. Some of us are angry about COVID policy, and some of us have moved on and are bored even with being angry about it. But COVID has been the biggest public policy disaster in peacetime of the last century. And every day brings new studies, new findings that confirm the last 2 years of life in the Western world as a blizzard of lies. Just a couple of data points, more or less at random. According to the latest vaccine report by the UK Health Security Agency, so that's pretty official, vaccine effectiveness for triple jabbed young persons is below 0. For triple-jabbed old persons, it's also below 0. These graphics come from my old chum, Toby Young's Daily Skeptic website, because for some reason The government agency gives you the numbers but doesn't put them into an at-a-glance graph. If you're 60 or older, the triple jabbed are 5 times more likely to get COVID than the unvaccinated. If you're over 80, 3 jabs provide no statistically detectable protection whatsoever against hospitalization. Oh well, at least the COVID regime has been highly effective as just another government racket. £37 billion of UK COVID relief money was filched by fraudsters. For purposes of comparison, that's a third of the NHS total budget. A third of the NHS total annual budget filched by COVID fraudsters. Hundreds of footballers and other athletes have died of heart attacks after getting a COVID shot. Hundreds of guys dropping dead, often on the pitch in the peak of condition. There are figures suggesting as many as 20,000 residents of the United Kingdom may have died from the vaccine. Certainly, there's a lot of unexplained excess mortality around among the young and middle-aged, including minor trends of 52-year-old celebrities dropping dead in Australia. This is a public policy scandal, although a lot of highly educated citizens of developed nations share a measure of the blame. These are the people who drone zombie-like, follow the science, must follow the science, follow the science, as if being a free-born individual involves no more than listening to whatever Professor Pantsdown and those overnighted nitwits at the press conference say and then doing it forever and ever. The media bear a certain responsibility too. If you listen to the BBC, it's like March 2020, now and forever. But the biggest scandal of all was going on right under our nose. And by that I mean directly under your nose, the little toddler on the floor. He should be walking by now. But because you went along with the lockdown rubbish and the masks and the home confinement, he has lived his entire life in a world without visual cues. He can't tell whether grandma is smiling or frowning. That's if he even gets to see her. So entirely predictably, Ofsted, and just for you craven prostrators before officialdom, it's got off in front of it, so it's official, it's expert, it's not some kooky QAnon dark web Russian manipulation malinformation site that's been cooked up on the fly by Macedonian content farmers. It's Ofsted. And they've now issued a report finding that the COVID generation of moppets have, quote, limited vocabulary and some struggle, quote, to respond to basic facial expressions. Children have missed out on hearing stories, singing and having conversations. One provider commented that children appear to have spent more time on screens and have started to speak in accents and voices that resemble the material they have watched. So your kid may be starting to talk like some awful California Valley girl with the upturned inflection at the end of every sentence, just because that's the only semi-human contact that he's had. Children turning 2 years old will have been surrounded by adults wearing masks for their whole lives and have therefore been unable to see lip movements or mouth shapes as regularly. Some providers have reported that delays to children's speech and language development have led them to not socializing with other children as readily as they would have expected previously. Oh boy, wow, there's a surprise. So in a decade or so, they'll be lonely, morose, suicidal, and the rest of the gang will be Generation Asbo. Kathy Gingell edits The Conservative Woman, an indispensable website, and we're always glad to see her. Kathy, this Ofsted report, I'm very glad to see it, but it's hundreds of pages of what could have been foreseen at least 1 year and 11 months ago, isn't it?
Yes, it certainly could. And we began publishing quite quickly from late April, May of 2020 on looking at the downsides and the huge anxiety this was causing parents, and the actual lack of evidence for shutting schools. It was quite horrifying, and nobody listened. And I felt all the people who should have been fighting for children, the mothers, the teachers, the social workers, somehow they'd already become terrorized or compliant to the state, that made them unable to be the tigresses for their children that they needed to be. Yet at the same time, their own anxiety and loneliness and feelings of inability to cope with work and their children at home were mounting. And this basically went on for what? A year and a half. The government played cat and mouse with parents on school openings and closures, kept on saying, we'll open, and then we didn't. The unions, the teachers' unions are absolutely culpable. I'm sorry, Mark, I'm so angry about this. I've been angry about it all along. The government was weak. This was an anti-health policy. Imagine shutting up small children in 12th floor flats with a mother going out cleaning, inadequately cared for. This was fine for Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson, who've got Chequers to go to take their kids to. Matt Hancock's got a second country home. This was the big between the upper middle classes and the rest. Some of them, I've met people, they positively enjoyed lockdown. They loved having their kids at home. Their kids could do all these arts and crafts. But the majority, sorry, it's so difficult to stay calm about this. There are 3 million children in this led by single-parent families. Those are the families who are struggling. There is no condemnation here. This is a fact. They are struggling. They were the ones who are the most vulnerable. They were the ones with the autistic children, with the disabled children. Disabled children were virtually imprisoned. You have to look at the interview that your colleague Mark Dolan did with Bob Moran, the cartoonist who was shamefully sacked from the Telegraph. His situation with his disabled daughter, he was able to articulate that very clearly in a way of the suffering that child went through, that child's regression, their suffering and difficulty. He articulated it in a way that hundreds of parents have not been able to do.
No.
So
I'm glad. Yep.
Well,
carry
good for
on,
Amanda
Kathy.
Spielman, but there's a word she didn't use in that report, and it's cruelty.
Yep, absolutely. I regard this as a form of child abuse. I'm glad you mentioned the teachers' unions, or educators, or whatever we're meant to call them now, because in the end they prioritized absolutely absurdly and without science their own so-called safety and security over the safety of the children. It's still going on a lot of places around the world. In New York City, children have to wear masks, and in many other places in America they have to sit outside even though it's freezing cold in the middle of winter. And this is all because the Democrat teachers' unions are one of the biggest players in the Democrat Party of Joe Biden and all the rest of it. So Joe Biden and co don't want to upset them. Here, what I don't get is that, you know, the teachers are not big supporters of Boris Johnson and his ministry. So why on earth did the government not act sooner to stop the abuse of Britain's children?
Well, the Conservatives have been just as terrified of the teachers' union as anyone else was. And the fact is they're hand in glove with Labour. You know well, like everybody knows here, Labour was constantly pushing the lockdown agenda. One of the tragedies of lockdown is that we haven't had an opposition within Parliament. Any opposition has been extra-parliamentary, and it's shameful. And so the teachers, and really you can go back to the Conservatives when they came in with David Cameron, they needed to take on the teaching unions then. They didn't. It's one of the biggest failures of conservatism since 2010. And since then, we've been subject to the ridiculous dictates of modern teaching ideology. Well, it's not teaching. What is it? You know, sort of craziness, the self-hate, the denial of our history, the negativity, the transgender rubbish. All this stuff where the woke has constantly trumped sensible education. So that's the broader context. So we've got this specific picture of lockdown that fell into this extraordinary situation where the state has made parents dependent on schools for wraparound care. This has been growing since Tony Blair. And now we suddenly have it pulled out from the parents' feet. These are parents who have been taught to outsource their parenting to childcare centres. This was never good anyway. But this is, and these parents are parents without the resilience, without the experience, without the resources. Suddenly, that's broken by the state. I mean, it's a double cruelty. It's so perverse.
There's a contradiction here, though, Kathy. You mentioned the transgender thing. Now, we're all told, we have to be supportive of, if little Jimmy decides he now wants to be little Jenny, we have to provide an environment for him in which he can become little Jenny comfortably in the classroom without having to be damaged by us not recognizing his beautiful, if sudden femininity. That's on the one hand, but here I wonder if we're not underneath all this, we support trans kids, we support intersex kids, we support whatever you pansexual kids. Underneath all this, we're just being totally bloody cruel to the generality of kids. The COVID generation of children are going to be damaged for the next 20 years because of an obviously abusive policy.
Well, it is abusive, and this is what happens when you commodify children. This is what happens when the state nationalises children. I mean, the wonderful thing is the way the Conservatives have carried on with the nationalising of children instead of defending the family. And so already they're commodified, already they're sort of externalised. So already you're not treating them as humans. We're the only species that really does this, that's now in the last 20 to 30 years decided to outsource babies. So no wonder people become, what's the word? You become desensitized. Would anyone believe that you can have a mask on with a child and that the child can't see your face, can't see you smile? It's inhuman. So yes, we're becoming rapidly dehumanized. Maybe they're setting that up for when they'll dehumanize us.
No, it's a big theme of the present day. I was thinking just only a couple of hours ago about my beloved daughter's first birthday, when she didn't really understand the concept of birthdays or birthday cakes or parties, and the pleasure she took in it was because of our visual cues. If we'd all been masked up, that would not have merely have been a non-event, it would have been a scary event. It's what we've done. Children are the principal victims in order to protect grandparents that they're not even allowed to see. Thank you so much, Kathy. You can read all Kathy's stuff over at the Conservative Woman website, which is well worth visiting every day. Let me know what you think. GBViews at gbnews.uk. John O'Sullivan's on deck from Budapest to talk populism, and Con Coughlin and Sue Cook are standing by, all straight ahead. We'll be right back.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss, and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children, and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London EC3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Welcome to a new regular feature, the Mark Steyn Show headline of the day. This one's from my beloved hometown, the Toronto Sun. Vladimir Putin bathes in blood of deer antlers to boost his sex drive. That's because all the yes-men in the Kremlin do nothing but pass the buck. Let's get to your thoughts on whether children have been affected developmentally by the lockdown. Julian says, well, I keep hearing the screams of next door's kids, so something went wrong. Alex says, I don't believe a word of their reports. This is Ofsted, super official. It's just to criticise the government. Teachers and politicians did their best with such an unprecedented event. It isn't actually that unprecedented. It's thinking like that gets you into the mess you're in, Alex. The Spanish flu, the Great Plague of London. Nobody thought of actually imprisoning children in their first years of life and denying them social contact and having their parents wear masks and their teachers wear masks. You're not a child, Alec. I take it you're not, unless you're a particularly advanced 18-month-year-old who's already learnt to tweet and email, but assuming you're a little older than that, don't just do this, teachers and politicians did their best, and golly, they're the experts and we should just fall in line. If it's an unprecedented event, the experts don't know anything more about it than you do, and it was obvious in the late spring of 2020 that these policies were damaging our children and that they will live with the consequences. Johnny says, and incidentally, the most important education is primary school education. So if you screw up a kid's first 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years, you can keep him in class until he's 57 and you won't be able to undo the damage you did in his first 10 years. Johnny says, my son was at university doing a hard science degree. He was forced to pay the full fees to sit alone in a room for a year with no social contact, no live lectures and no university facilities of any kind, no sport, not even a bar, no concession to the degree at all. Shameful, says Johnny. Could be worse if you have the misfortune to be the parent of an American child. You're paying $70,000 a year for the privilege of him to be taught by Zoom call. Far too many people go to university. We would be better, as I said, focusing on getting primary school education right. And lowering the number of people who go to university, whether in the United Kingdom or elsewhere. Yesterday was election day in Hungary, and the incumbent Viktor Orban wound up taking his 4th victory lap, much to the dismay of the Eurocrats and establishment America, who all detest the guy and regard him as mini-me to Putin's Dr. Evil. The Prime Minister won over 2/3 of the seats in Parliament in what will be a supermajority for what he calls Christian, democratic, conservative, patriotic politics. While he was at it, in his victory speech, he also took a swipe at Brussels and President Zelensky next door in Ukraine. Joining me now from Budapest is Mrs. Thatcher's former speechwriter and the president of the Danube Institute, John O'Sullivan. John, you actually predicted this to me a couple of months ago, but not quite the scale of the victory. Did that surprise you?
Yes, it did. I thought that he would win. I thought he probably wouldn't get the 2/3 majority, but he would win reasonably comfortably. And even then, I was slightly nervous because the war had suddenly, the Ukraine war had entered the picture, and that could have been a wild card. As it turned out, I think it strengthened the likelihood of us getting back because people in Hungary were worried that they might be drawn into it. And although I think that's an exaggerated worry, nonetheless, he represented that anxiety and that prudence, and that really sealed the deal for him, I think. But yes, I mean, there are a lot of reasons he won, and most of the reasons that the other side thought they would win turned out to be illusory.
Well, the general attitude of Western European and North American elites was summed up in a tweet I saw from Anders Aslund, who's an academic who writes lots of interesting books on this subject, and he tweeted out, "If Hungary really votes overwhelmingly against democracy and for corruption, I cannot see why it should be accepted in the EU. Kick it out." So the voters of Hungary, John, are guilty of voting overwhelmingly against democracy. They demonstrate their hostility to democracy by voting in massive numbers. I don't think Anders Aslund has... I think he tweeted in haste there, but it basically sums up how Brussels and Washington think of the guy.
And a lot of other people. I mean, a man called Yasha Monk, who's a distinguished professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University, and also an intellectual valet to Tony Blair in one of his many democracy support organizations. He said exactly the same thing. And it makes you wonder what they actually think the purpose of democracy is, if it isn't to allow the voters to vote for someone who agrees with them. And there's no doubt that the voters generally agree with the 2/3 anyway, generally agree with Viktor Orban. The reason he's not popular in Brussels or with as Anders Aslund is two things. The first is that he is not an enthusiast for either global governments or Euro governments. He thinks most of the decisions in politics should be taken by the voters and by the elected representatives in national parliaments. And they don't agree with that. Essentially, they believe in more Europe, which is grabbing more powerful national parliaments and bringing it to Brussels. And the other reason is he's a social conservative. That is to say, he likes things not exactly the way they were, but he certainly thinks that the old attitudes, the religious traditions, the moral traditions, the cultural mores of the country should be respected by the courts, respected by international organizations. And a lot of the voters think exactly that. Don't want to live in a different country in the way that so many people in Western Europe have suddenly wake up to find themselves doing. And therefore, they rallied to him. But there are other very practical reasons too, Mark.
Well, I passed through Budapest, as you know, and Eastern Hungary a couple of weeks ago, and I just made a point. I don't get out and about as much as I'd like, but I just made a point of asking the charming waitresses who would bring me my breakfast what they thought about. And what was interesting to me is there was no sense of a revulsion against Viktor Orban. So in other words, the view of Viktor Orban in the West does not prevail on the streets. There's no sense of it. And a couple of those very charming waitresses would then tell me, confess a couple of days later, they said, oh, I'm not voting for Viktor Orban because he doesn't like foreigners. That was just because I was an English-speaking foreigner, and they assumed that I shared the same views on Viktor Orban of Washington Democrats and Brussels Eurocrats. So it wasn't a surprise to me. There's a big... The caricature of Orban isn't matched on the ground in Hungary, is it?
It isn't matched at all, in fact. When the ordinary Hungarians, particularly outside Budapest, learn what the rest of the world is said to think about them, they're amazed. They're amazed to be told they're not living in a free country. They feel it free. They feel they can say what they think. Now, it is worth saying that the immediate reactions to the elections last night have not been followed completely today. Quite a lot of secondary comment has been much more even-handed, and one of the themes of that secondary comment has been that Orban has been trying to establish a kind of new establishment, not just in politics, but a new establishment culturally, economically, administratively, in the same way that Tony Blair did actually in Britain. So that Blair populated quangos with a lot of his own like-minded Blairites. And this is something that Orban has done here as well, and done very successfully. That's one point. Now, it's perfectly true. We have to wait and see the cultural flowering that will emerge following the establishment of this new cultural establishment. But nonetheless, it's another reason why ordinary Hungarians feel that they're being governed in a Hungarian way and by themselves and not from abroad by people who don't understand them. And I think that's a key element in the appeal of Orbanism. Just to make one other point, the country's been well governed in one obvious way. Namely, people have got richer over the last 12 years, and that applies to poor people as well as rich. And there isn't a sense of constant crisis in Hungarian politics, as there is generally in British, German, UK, French politics. There is a sense that in an everyday old-fashioned way, the country's well governed.
Well, what do you think it means for populism elsewhere in Europe? We've gotten used to it getting so far west and no further, but we have the first round of the French presidential election coming up this weekend. Do you think there are any broader lessons from the Orban strategy?
Well, I think the principal lesson is that what people call populism, and it's not the phrase I would use, essentially it's a kind of democracy. What you call majoritarian democracy, as opposed to corrected democracy, corrected, that is, by liberal institutions in Brussels and domestically. So that's an important element in the appeal of Orban, that he stands for what we used to recognize as democracy. Namely, there's an election, a government's elected, next day it starts on its program. You don't get that feeling now in a lot of countries. You get the feeling that then we start discussing about how much power the government will have and whether the courts will block them doing this or that. This is another element in the appeal that he has.
Yes, that's a very important point. The lesson of the last 5 years, as the elites see it, is that these grunting, ignorant masses can vote for Trump, they can vote for Brexit, but they have to learn that when they vote outside the permitted bounds, it's not going to make any difference. And they were quite open about that. And although they're less open about it rhetorically, in Western Europe, certainly the elites seem to think similarly.
Well, I think that's true. And I would also say this, that the French elections are obviously going to be watched very carefully, because although the likelihood is that Emmanuel Macron will win, he is not going to win with anyone's enthusiastic support. It will be, if we have to vote for him, there isn't anyone else. Now, that may no longer be quite as true as it looked a few weeks ago. It looks as though Madame Le Pen Marine Le Pen might possibly win. That would be a major change. The other country where there might be a change is Italy, because the populist parties, so-called, are quite powerful there as well. Nobody thinks that populism is going to go away. They don't think necessarily it's going to sweep through Europe as they might have, as the elites worried it would do a few years ago after 2014. But it's a permanent part of the political system everywhere, and sometimes it's going to win power in its own right, as in Hungary, and sometimes in conjunction with other parties, as, for example, recently in Austria. That happened for a while, and in Italy. So and of course the elites in Brussels would say, and in Britain, because they regard the Conservative Party as a populist party, although of course it's neither more nor less populist than it's always been.
Yeah, that's right. Don't get me started. Don't get me started on that. The only populist flourish I like from Boris was his plan to put a roundabout at the bottom of the North Sea, with the Irish Sea, with exits for England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. That was super populist. Thank you very much, as always, John O'Sullivan. Last week, we marked the 40th anniversary of the Falklands War, which began on April 2nd, 1982, when the Argentine dictatorship seized on an all but undefended crown colony in the South Atlantic. And after last week's show, I realised we'd forgotten to mention perhaps the most obvious aspect of it, and that is we won. And whatever you think of 20 years in Afghanistan, you certainly can't say that about it. Con Coughlin is the Telegraph's longtime defence editor, and we appreciate him joining us. Con, as we see in Ukraine, war is not just a simple matter of who's the bigger, more powerful power. There are other factors that come into it. And when I look back at the Falklands, there was strategic clarity at the top in a way that perhaps there wasn't in the wars of the 21st century waged in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yes, well, it was a very straightforward mission. Go to the Falklands and win them back. I think the uncertainty, Mark, came from the political classes. And I think you'll be well aware that although Margaret Thatcher thought that we had no option but to go and get them back, there were a lot of people, the so-called wets in her cabinet, the Francis Pims, etc., that were very dubious about the whole thing. Not to mention the whole of the British establishment, not the military, but the Foreign Office and a lot of other government departments, and of course a lot of the media were deeply sceptical and thought, why on earth in 1982 is Britain about to embark on another colonial war, and comparisons were drawn with Suez, etc. But there was, from a military point of view and from Downing Street's perspective, a very clear and unequivocal mission statement. British sovereignty has been invaded, and we need to go there and show the world that we will not put up with this. And you mentioned Ukraine, and the similarity with Ukraine is very much, I know Boris Johnson has his critics, but I think on Ukraine he has shown the kind of leadership we've been crying out for, and he seems to be quite certain in his mind that what Russia is doing is very wrong, and that we must support the Ukrainians by any means possible.
Isn't there also another comparison, Con, in that Russia felt it was reacting when it went into Ukraine because America, the global leader, was weak. And in the 60s and 70s, the West had been losing a lot of real estate all over the map to the Soviets and their proxies. And it was an entirely reasonable view of General Galtieri to think, oh yeah, I should just take the Falklands. I mean, you're not going to tell me that the toothless old British... We've seen America in Vietnam. You're not going to tell me that the toothless old British lion is going to rouse itself in defense of a remote colony. And so, again, it was the perception of Western weakness that led to the act of aggression.
Well, certainly, I think that's a good point, Mark. I mean, the thing is, of course, when you look back at the history of the Falklands, the Galtieri junta had been agitating about Las Malvinas, as they call them, since he came to power. And the signals were there. But, of course, the dear old Foreign Office just thought, oh, you know, we don't need to worry about this, and it's all bluster, and completely and utterly miscalculated. And, of course, it resulted in dear old Peter Carrington having to resign, even though it was the useless officials beneath him who were responsible for the fiasco of not spotting what the Argentinians were up to. And I suppose, you know, the parallel with Ukraine is that it was quite clear from the end of last year that the massive military force that Putin was constructing, both in Russia and Belarus, and the naval fleet in the Black Sea, was not there just for military exercises, but there was a more malign intent. But the bigger picture, the bigger point you make about Western weakness and the perception of Western weakness, I think is very apposite, particularly with the Biden administration. I think, you know, if you go back to the Syria vote in 2013, when President Obama, as you well remember, had said that you know, the use of chemical weapons in Syria was a red line. If the Assad regime passed that red line, there will be action. There was no action. And 2 years later, Putin moved into Syria and has basically turned it into his fiefdom. Ergo, Syria is one of only 4 countries to back Russia at the Security Council over its invasion of Ukraine. But the signals, and it goes back to Obama, but of course Biden was his vice president. But after the fiasco of Afghanistan, I mean, it is no surprise that the military build-up to invade Ukraine began after the Afghan fiasco. That's the time frame. And Putin did think he could get away with it, just like Galtieri.
Yep, that's very true. Weakness is a provocation, Con, in 2022 as it was in 1982. Thank you for that. Great to see you. You can read Con in The Telegraph, and you should. Stump the Steyn's coming up. You can ask me anything. gbviews@gbnews.uk. And the one and only Sue Cook is here. She's been to the Falklands because she decided to recreate the ill-fated Shackleton Antarctic expedition. Because who doesn't say, oh yeah, Sir Ernest Shackleton, why don't we do that? Sue will be with us in just a moment. Don't go anywhere.
Coming up on Dan Wootton tonight, should the propaganda of the Ukraine war be a reminder to the West that free speech is worth fighting for? Top columnist Mick Hume debates. Plus, there's an emotional update from one of our Ukrainian commentators on the ground. Elsewhere in the show, GB News stars Nigel Farage and Darren Grimes are let loose on the topics that matter most to you. And I'll break down the headlines of the day and the newspaper front pages with my superstar panel. The broadcaster and loose women star Carol McGiffin, Conservative voice Calvin Robinson, and making her debut, the economic commentator Miata Fanbula. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children, and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Sue Cook has had a terrific career in every known medium. She started on Capital Radio with Michael Aspel and Kenny Everett and Gerald Harper back when the station had a really tremendous style. She moved on to telly and the likes of the BBC's Crime Watch. And she then started writing novels, one of which I bought at Heathrow and read in a single sitting all the way across the Atlantic. It was Force of Nature. The last time I complimented a novelist on a novel, I couldn't remember the title of it, and it was all very embarrassing, but I remember that one. Sue, it's great to see you. I check in on your Twitter feed several times during the course of the week, and you don't tweet a lot, but you do retweet interesting things that I sort of feel in the days when you were hosting shows like You and Yours and Crime Watch and all those, that are the kind of interesting takes on things that you would have been minded to bring to the attention of your listeners and viewers. The BBC doesn't seem to do so much of that anymore, does it?
I think the whole business of broadcasting has changed quite a bit. But I started broadcasting back in 1975 when inflation was running at 24%. I don't know if you remember those days. And interest rates, I think, went up as high as 17%. And we were suddenly, we had to be the consumer's champion. It was really important that, a jar of coffee would go up 5 pence in a day. So we were very much on guard, looking for how people can save money and, how people weren't going to be scammed or conned out of anything. And I think the whole of my raison d'etre as a broadcaster has always been to champion the ordinary person and to inform them, just provide information. It wasn't really about, I didn't feel it was about me. It was about me providing a conduit of information towards ordinary people, just of whom I was one, if that makes sense.
Well, I think it's changed. I don't know about Capital Radio, but it's certainly changed at the BBC, I think, because it seems very odd to me now that so many media institutions are interested in actually suppressing information. So that somebody can be quite distinguished, they can be a respected virologist or whatever, and they'll come up with a particular contrarian viewpoint on the COVID, and it's not enough. Nowadays you don't have them on and argue it out and defend their position. Now you just act to suppress them entirely, and it's slightly bizarre to me that people go into the media in order to shut other people up. It's a very weird situation.
I've tried very hard to work out how possibly this is happening. Well, you know about the Ofcom guidance, which advised against any giving airtime to any unverified source of information. This came out in May 2020, shortly after the first lockdown. And they said you mustn't give out any statements that question the narrative or undermine the mainstream view of the disease. So I think they took that very seriously. I mean, I still know BBC people and bump into them now and then, and I'm amazed how I think they genuinely still think that they're in fear of their lives. I think they genuinely. I heard talk the other day saying, I really think Boris shouldn't have released these restrictions so early. I mean, really, I think everybody should still be wearing masks. And this was just to each other. This is just the way people think. I think they've been so worried. My charitable view, I have an uncharitable view as well, but the charitable view is that I think they really thought we mustn't allow anybody to die of COVID. They didn't kind of think about everybody dying and suffering terribly under all the other restrictions and lockdown problems. They just thought we mustn't let anybody die of COVID, and we must make people comply. Compliance is the great God, and we must make people comply with the restrictions, so we mustn't say anything that will discourage them. So therefore, we never heard anything critical about the members of SAGE. We never heard anything critical about the PCR test, which I was right from day one dying to. I wished so much I was back at the BBC. I'd have sent somebody around to all the different testing centres and sent the same sample to each, because they all had different amplification cycles, and just seen what the different results were, and what sort of tests were being done and what conditions they were being done. Put a mole in there or something. All this investigative journalism I'd love to have been able to do, and they didn't seem to feel that they should do.
No, it's very. You said that was your charitable view and that you had an uncharitable view. I'm not as accomplished a broadcaster as you, Sue, but I know when I'm being hit over the head with a cricket bat. So here's the obvious follow-up. What's the uncharitable view then?
Well, I thought that was a hostage to fortune saying that. But I think they've... they just seem to think that they wanted to go along with the government line and at all costs, and literally at all costs. So it used to drive us all mad, didn't it? Those awful press conferences where the three of them standing up there, Pinky and Perky and Boris in the middle. And you were dying for one of the journalists, just one of them, to ask, why can't we, why aren't we seeing the damage this is doing? Why can't we stop this a little bit early? They were all saying, why can't we lock down more? Why can't we lock down harder? I mean, I think I've got huge respect for people like Laura Kunsberg and Robert Peston, but I could have, thrown a brick at them for constantly asking why we're not locking down harder and faster, and why don't we just lock people in their homes forever?
Well, I switched on the BBC World Service the other day. That was my first mistake. And I was astonished at how they're still talking as if it's March 2020. Now, we've had this, you can say with Brexit, you can say with climate change, that the BBC makes, and the mass media in general makes its views known. I mean, and now we have the COVID, which is really the most extreme version of that. Are we just going to have this with more and more subjects in which there's an official view and it's just presented as the only view? Because that would be a very dark world to live in.
It would, wouldn't it? I just don't think they can give it up. It's like living with an abusive lover. COVID fear is like some kind of abusive lover that they've got so used to living with, they can't bring themselves to actually tear themselves away. It's part of who they are and how they define themselves. So I think it's going to go on for quite a while.
That's a very depressing thought. There's the world, when you talk about you doing those consumer reports because something had gone up by 14 pence or whatever, even on inflation and the disruptions to the supply chain, which raise questions about whether we should be so dependent on China or Russian gas and oil or whatever. Even something like doing the consumerist stuff you used to do on Capital right at the beginning, even that seems to have been corrupted in terms of genuine coverage of it.
I think the huge problem is, and I think it really is a huge problem, is that we've lost trust in the mainstream media. And I think that's really dangerous. I think we need to be able to trust our media. And I feel, and I know a lot of people I know feel the same, I can't really work out the wheat from the chaff. I take everything with a pinch of salt now. And I think that's a huge loss. And we're going through a war. You know, we've got all sorts, and we're going through all this inflation, and we've got energy crisis, and we need to believe that our media are telling us the right things. And I think they've lost that. I thought you were very, GBNews is fantastic. You were very brave opening the show, talking about the £37 billion that are being filched by fraudsters, and the vaccine, which is another thing. There's a lot to be said, a lot of disturbing facts about the vaccine, which we'd just like to examine. We can examine it and we can find out that some things are right and some things are wrong. But we've got to look at them.
Well, you're absolutely right, Sue, and maybe the BBC would like to sign you up for that, to do it for, even if it's just half an hour, even if it's just half an hour a week. Because you're quite right that once trust is lost, it's all but impossible to get it back. The great Sue Cook, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Sue. That's going to do it. But never fear, Dan Wootton's here to make your Monday marvellous for 2 swinging, groovy hours starting right now. Stay safe, stay free.
Hello again. A wet day to come across Scotland tomorrow, whereas much of the UK will be dry and bright. But it's not just rain for Scotland, because across the north of Scotland we could see some heavy snow, and there is a Met Office yellow warning in place. For most it's turned a lot milder. In between these two weather fronts is some pretty warm air, but this one is sinking south, allowing the cold air to return across the far north. So some wintry showers across Shetland and Orkney. Damp for northern England, particularly to the west of the Pennines. Rain for Northern Ireland and western Scotland overnight. A bit of drizzly here and there across Wales and southwest England, but much of southern England, eastern England will have a dry night. And look at the temperatures. A mild night, but that cold air in place across the far north means there will be a frost, and with that cold air hitting the wet weather, we're going to see more and more snow coming in during Tuesday. Now, initially just over the hills, but coming down to lower levels across Aberdeenshire, Caithness, Sutherland,